Good evening, everyone. My name is Ian Wilson, and I serve as director of the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life, a research center here at the University of Alberta's Augustana campus. Welcome to the Jean and Peter Lockheed Performing Arts Center for this special Ronning Center event. Right here at the outset, I'd like to thank the staff of the Performing Arts Center for helping make this event possible. I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Ronning Center for their financial support, as well as Diane McGall, the center's administrative assistant, for her tireless work that brings all of this together. Thanks so much to all of you. Our primary aim at the Ronning Center is to facilitate interdisciplinary research, critical teaching, ethical reflection, and public programming on a range of issues in which religious communities, practices, and ideas are directly implicated, or on which thoughtful religious perspectives might be brought to bear. It was with this aim in mind that we invited journalist Chris Hedges to come to Camrose and spend an evening with us. Mr. Hedges is a seasoned journalist who has worked for media outlets such as the Christian Science Monitor, the Dallas Morning News, and the New York Times. He spent 15 years at the Times, where he was a foreign correspondent and bureau chief, reporting from conflict and war zones, including the Balkans and the Middle East. In 2002, while with the Times, he was part of a team of journalists that received the Pulitzer-prize for their writing on global terrorism. He has also received the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights in Journalism, among other prestigious honors in his field. Mr. Hedges is the author of a dozen books, including, for example, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, published in 2002, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America, published in 2006, and his most recent work, America, The Farewell Tour, published by Knopf Canada in 2018. Copies of this text are available for purchase in the theater lobby, and we'll have a book signing after the lecture this evening. Currently, Mr. Hedges writes a weekly column for the online magazine Truth Dig, where he speaks out boldly against global capitalism, against climate change denial, and against mass incarceration, among other topics. It's safe to say that Chris Hedges is no stranger to public life. But he is also no stranger to religion. Growing up the child of a Presbyterian minister, Mr. Hedges earned a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School before he went into journalism. And in 2014, he was ordained by the Presbyterian Church for his teaching of college credit courses at New Jersey state prisons, a fusing of religion and public life if there ever was one. Mr. Hedges does not shy away from revealing challenging and sometimes ugly truths about today's global world. Regardless of your personal convictions, political positions, or religious inclinations, he will push you to think deeply about the real challenges that our society faces today, which makes him an ideal guest for the Chester Ronning Center. Tonight, we've invited him to share his thoughts about religion and public life in today's world, to challenge us and to spark both thought and action in that world. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Chris Hedges.
Thank you. The issue before us is death. Not only our individual death, which is more imminent for some of us tonight than others, but our collective death. We have begun the sixth great mass extinction, driven by our 150-year binge on fossil fuel. The litany of grim statistics are not unfamiliar to many of you. We are pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at 10 times the rate of the mass extinction known as the Great Dying, which occurred 252 million years ago. The glaciers in Alaska alone are losing an estimated 75 billion tons of ice every year. The oceans, which absorb over 90% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, are warming and acidifying, melting the polar ice caps and resulting in rising sea levels and oxygen-starved ocean dead zones. We await a 50 gigaton burp or pulse of methane from thawing Arctic permafrost beneath the East Siberian Arctic shelf, which will release about 2/3 of the total carbon dioxide pumped into the atmosphere since the beginning of the industrial era. Some 150 to 200 species of plant, insect, bird, and mammal are going extinct every 24 hours, 1,000 times the natural or background rate. This pace of extinction is greater than anything the world has experienced since the disappearance of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Ultimately, feedback mechanisms will accelerate the devastation, and there will be nothing we can do to halt the obliteration. Past mass extinctions on Earth were characterized by abrupt warming between 6 to 7 degrees Celsius. We are barreling towards those numbers. The mathematical models for this global temperature rise predict an initial 70% die-off of the human species, culminating with total death. The corporate forces that have commodified the natural world for profit have also commodified human beings. We are as expendable to global corporations as the Barrier Reef or the great sequoias. These corporations and ruling elites, which have orchestrated the largest transference of wealth upward in human history, with the globe's richest 1% owning half the world's wealth, force us to kneel before the dictates of the global marketplace. They have seized control of our governments, extinguishing democracy, corrupting law, and building alliances with neo-fascists and authoritarians as the ruling ideology of neoliberalism loses credibility and is exposed as a con. They have constructed pervasive and sophisticated systems of internal security, wholesale surveillance, and militarized police, along with criminalizing poverty to crush dissent. These corporate capitalists are the modern versions of the Canaanite priests who served the biblical idol Moloch, which demanded child sacrifice. And as in this ancient Canaanite religion, it is our children who are being sacrificed to these mute idols. Their future is being taken from them. These corporate forces are, in biblical terms, forces of death. They will, unchecked, create more human misery and death than the evils of Nazism and Stalinism combined. Actually, I hardly feel constrained to try and make head or tail of this condition of the world. Walter Benjamin wrote, "On this planet, a great number of civilizations have perished in blood and horror. Naturally, one must wish for the planet that one day it will experience a civilization that has abandoned blood and horror. In fact, I am inclined to assume that our planet is waiting for this. But it is terribly doubtful whether we can bring such a present to its 100 or 400th million birthday party. And if we don't, the planet will finally punish us, its unthoughtful well-wishers, by presenting us with the last judgment." The opposite of hope is not cynicism, although I have been accused of being a cynic. The opposite of hope is not despair, although I have been accused of peddling despair. The opposite of hope is grief. And if you do not feel this profound grief over our abject failure to thwart the ecocide we have seen coming for more than 3 decades, you are shutting your eyes to reality. You are imbibing in the happy thoughts that define the conditioned helplessness peddled by mass culture, the flight from reality that only ensures our immolation on the altar of Moloch. Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. Rabbi Earl Grolman writes, "It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve." So grieve. And from that grief, hold in renewed awe and reverence this world around us and those that inhabit it. Live to honor and protect life, the sacred, to defy the culture of death, not because you will triumph, but because you have made a choice to be something other than a cog in the vast machinery of death. The Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet, relentlessly persecuted and imprisoned for years, eventually dying in exile, knew something of grief. But he also knew something of what it means to live. He writes in his poem on living, "Living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness, like a squirrel, for example. I mean, without looking for something beyond and above living. I mean, living must be your whole occupation. Living is no laughing matter. You must take it seriously, so much so, and to such a degree that, for example, your hands tied behind your back to the wall, or else in a laboratory in your white coat and safety glasses, you can die for people, even for people whose faces you've never seen, even though you know living is the most real, the most beautiful thing. I mean, you must take living so seriously that even at 70, for example, you'll plant olive trees, and not for your children either, but because, although you fear death, you don't believe it, because living, I mean, weighs heavier. Let's say we're seriously ill, need surgery, which is to say we might not get up from the white table. Even though it's impossible not to feel sad about going a little too soon, we'll still laugh at the jokes being told. We'll look out the window to see if it's raining, or still wait anxiously for the latest newscast. Let's say we're at the front for something worth fighting for, say. There in the first offensive on that very day, we might fall on our face dead. But we'll still worry ourselves to death about the outcome of the war, which could last years. Let's say we're in prison and close to 50, and we have 18 more years, say, before the iron doors will open. We'll still live with the outside, with its people and animals, struggle and wind. I mean, with those outside beyond the walls. I mean, however and wherever we are, we must live as if we will never die. This earth will grow cold, a star among stars and one of the smallest, a gilded mote on blue velvet. I mean this, our great earth. This earth will grow cold one day, not like a block of ice or even a dead cloud, but like an empty walnut, it will roll along in pitch black space. You must grieve for this right now. You have to feel this sorrow now. For the world must be loved this much if we're going to say, I lived. The armies of bureaucrats, technicians, engineers, academics, scientists, publicists, and managers that orchestrate our extinction do so for scraps. They are not necessarily driven by malice. They sell their souls for a paltry 30 pieces of silver, promotions, a few awards or prizes, status, a nice car, a house, job security. They are morally fragmented. They refuse to name the vast evil they make possible, finding their moral worth in their tangential role as good partners, parents, and neighbors who contribute to their communities. They are the respectable people. They focus on their incremental tasks. They refuse to see the whole. Those who make evil possible, as Goethe and Dostoevsky understood, are usually like this, banal and ordinary. But what of the price of peace? The radical priest Daniel Berrigan asked. I think of the good, decent, peace-loving people I have known by the thousands, and I wonder, how many of them are afflicted with the wasting disease of normalcy, that even as they declare for peace, their hands reach out with an instinctive spasm in the direction of their comforts, their home, their security, their income, their future, their plans. That 5-year plan of studies, that 10-year plan of professional status, that 20-year plan of family growth and unity, that 50-year plan of decent life and honorable natural demise. Of course, let us have peace, we cry, but at the same time, let us have normalcy. Let us lose nothing. Let our lives stand intact. Let us know neither prison nor ill repute nor disruption of ties. And because we must encompass this and protect that, and because at all costs, our hopes must march on schedule, and because it is unheard of that in the name of peace a sword should fall, disjoining that fine and cunning web that our lives have woven, because it is unheard of that good men and women should suffer injustice, or families be sundered, or good repute be lost, because of this we cry peace and cry peace, and there is no peace. There is no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no makers of peace because the making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as exigent, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bring disgrace and prison and death in its wake. Our impending extinction is a product of our failed democracy, incapable of promoting the common good. The warning signs of fascism, of virulent nationalism, an assault on basic freedoms and human rights, a demonizing of the vulnerable, the other, and the weak as a rallying cry for a national crusade, a grotesque hyper-masculinity, a control of the mass media, a sacralization of power, in our case, by Christian fascists, a crushing of labor movements, attacks on culture, science, rationalism, and intellectual inquiry, a constant appeal to law and order, corruption, nepotism, cronyism, and fraudulent elections. These fascist undercurrents are gaining strength. In the United States, the problem is not Trump. Trump is the symptom, not the disease. He is what is vomited up by a failed democracy. The French sociologist Émile Durkheim, in his classic book on suicide, examined the disintegration of social bonds that drive individuals and societies to personal and collective acts of self-destruction. He found that when social bonds are strong, individuals achieve a healthy balance between individual initiative and communal solidarity, which he calls a life-sustaining equilibrium. These individuals and communities have the lowest rates of suicide. The individuals and societies most susceptible to self-destruction, he wrote, are those for whom these bonds, this equilibrium, have been shattered. Societies are held together by a web of social bonds that give individuals a sense of being part of a collective and engaged in a project larger than the self. This collective expresses itself through rituals such as elections and democratic participation, an appeal to patriotism and shared national beliefs. The bonds provide meaning, a sense of purpose, status, dignity. They offer psychological protection from impending mortality and the meaninglessness that comes with being isolated and alone. The shattering of these bonds plunges individuals into deep psychological distress that leads ultimately to acts of self-annihilation. Durkheim called this state of hopelessness and despair anomie, which he defined as rulelessness. Rulelessness means the norms that govern a society and create a sense of organic solidarity no longer function. The belief, for example, that if we work hard, obey the law, and get a good education, we can achieve stable employment, social status, and mobility, along with financial security, becomes a lie. The old rules, imperfect and often untrue for poor people of color, nevertheless were not a complete fiction. They offered some, especially those from the white, working and middle class, modest social and economic advancement. But the capture of political and economic power by the corporate elites, along with the redirecting of all institutions towards the further consolidation of their power and wealth, has broken the social bonds that hold society together. This rupture has unleashed a widespread malaise Durkheim would have recognized. When society is strongly integrated, he wrote, it keeps individuals in a state of dependency, holding them to be in its service and consequently not permitting them to dispose of themselves as they wish. Society is thus opposed to them escaping from their obligation towards it through death. The bond that attaches them to their common purpose attaches them to life. And in any case, the high goal towards which their gaze is turned alleviates the suffering that they feel from life's troubles. Finally, in a coherent and vital community, there is a continual exchange of ideas and feelings from all to each and from each to all, which is like mutual moral support, so that the individual, instead of being reduced to his or her resources only, participates in the collective energy and draws on it when his or her own is exhausted. The reconfiguration of society into an oligarchy, the collapse of democratic institutions have left most of the population disempowered. The elites, predatory by nature, have discarded all restraint. The state of disorganization or anomie is thus reinforced by the fact that passions are less disciplined at the very time when they need stronger discipline, Durkheim noted, of the avarice of the rich. It is not for nothing that so many religions have celebrated the benefits and the moral value of poverty, Durkheim wrote. This is because of all schools, it is the one that best teaches human beings how to restrain themselves. By obliging us to exercise constant discipline over ourselves, it prepares us to accept collective discipline with docility, while wealth, by exalting the individual, constantly risks awakening the spirit of rebellion that is the very font of immortality. The political process, especially in the United States, as the research by Professors Gillens and Page underscores, no longer advances the interests of the average citizen. It has turned the consent of the governed into a cruel joke. The central point that emerges from our research is that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence, they wrote. This facade of democratic process eviscerates one of the primary social bonds in a democratic state and abolishes the vital shared belief that citizens have the power to govern themselves, that government exists to promote and protect their rights and interests. The economic structures, like the political structures, have been reconfigured to mock the belief in a meritocracy and that hard work lends to a productive and valued role in society. American productivity, as the New York Times pointed out, has increased 77% since 1973, but hourly pay has grown by only 12%. If the federal minimum wage in the United States was attached to productivity, it would be more than $20 an hour, not $7.25. Some 41.7 million American workers, a third of the workforce, earn less than $12 an hour, and most of them do not have access to employer-sponsored health insurance. A decade after the 2008 financial crash, the average middle-class family in the United States net worth is more than $40,000 below what it was in 2007, and the net worth of black families is down 40%, and for Latino families, this figure has dropped 46%. The economic disparity and political dysfunction have been exacerbated by the collapse of our judicial system. There is an aggressive criminalization of the poor, while the ruling elites are protected by high-priced lawyers and non-enforcement or rewriting of laws. Amid selective enforcement of laws in the rule-less society, the high rollers on Wall Street and in wealthy enclaves are not prosecuted for possessing and ingesting illegal drugs, but the poor are thrown in prison and must forfeit all their property for being caught with a small amount of the same drug. HSBC, the world's seventh largest bank by total assets, after admitting to laundering $800 million for Central and South American drug cartels, was slapped with largely symbolic fines and a deferred prosecution agreement, which is the legal equivalent of a get-out-of-jail-free card. The poor, meanwhile, are hounded, arrested, and fined for absurdly criminalized activity, such as, in St. Louis County, not mowing their lawns, loitering, selling loose cigarettes, carrying open containers of alcohol, or my favorite, obstructing pedestrian traffic, which means standing on a sidewalk. These fines are used to fill state and county budget shortfalls resulting from corporations and the wealthy fixing the rules to avoid paying meaningful taxes if they pay taxes at all. The virtual tax boycott by the rich has broken yet another social bond, the idea that everyone contributes a significant portion of his or her income to make the society function. The elites who sacrifice nothing for society and are not held accountable for their criminal behavior live in what Matt Taibbi calls a stateless archipelago. They are empowered to pillage the nation, amass obscene wealth, and wield unchecked political and legal control. The result has been the obliteration of the primary social bonds that, however biased in favor of the white majority, held the nation together. The shattering of these bonds has left millions, tens of millions of people adrift. Society, Durkheim wrote, is no longer sufficiently present for individuals. Those cast aside can participate in the society, Durkheim wrote, only through sadness. The self-destructive pathologies that plague the United States, Canada, and the rest of the industrialized world, opioid addiction, morbid obesity, gambling, suicide, sexual sadism, hate groups, and mass shootings arise out of this enemy. In my book, America, the Farewell Tour, is an examination of these pathologies and the enemy that fuels these self-destructive behaviors. Durkheim also noted that the poor often have lower rates of suicide. The poor know the rules are rigged against them. James Baldwin made much the same point when he wrote that African American men are less prone to a midlife crisis than white men because they are less susceptible to the myth of the American dream. Most African Americans, indeed most people of color, learn very early in life that there are two sets of rules. But the white majority, because of white supremacy, is more susceptible to the myth and therefore more infuriated when the myth is exposed as a con. And this, I suspect, is why nearly all mass shooters and members of right-wing hate groups, along with a majority of supporters of Trump, are white men. Capitalism, Durkheim wrote, is antithetical to creating and sustaining relationships that are vital to social bonds. Capitalism rewards those for whom relationships are transactional and temporary. Relationships under capitalism are mercenary. They are part of the scheme for personal advancement and require the oily manipulation of others. To advance in a capitalist system, it is necessary to build and then discard a series of ultimately hollow relationships. These empty relationships, and you can see them on display at any business gathering, contribute to the collective enemy and disintegration of social bonds. Capitalism may cater to the natural desire among many for self-enrichment, but you don't want this belief system to dominate society. Capitalism rewards single-minded narcissists and often con artists, devoid of empathy and incapable of remorse. It rewards those focused exclusively on personal gain and self-aggrandizement. These dedicated capitalists often lack the capacity to form meaningful bonds, seeing in other people tools for commodification and exploitation. Once a capitalist class achieves complete control, as it has in the United States, it dismantles the structures that make social bonds possible, seeing in them an impediment to profit. The more concentrated wealth becomes, as with corporate capitalism, the more damage it inflicts on society, sending jobs to overseas sweatshops and leaving workers at home underemployed or unemployed. Karl Marx saw alienation as a positive force, one that estranged workers from the means of production and moved them to question the structures of power, educate themselves about their exploitation and revolt. But for Durkheim, this alienation or enemy is debilitating. It is, he wrote, a collective asthenia that drains us of energy and will. It manifests itself in self-loathing. We may indeed understand what is happening around us, Durkheim argued, but we lack the ability to free ourselves from the despair, frustration, and rage that cripple our lives. Our actions require an object outside of themselves, Durkheim wrote. It is not because we need to sustain the illusion of some impossible immortality. It is because it is implicit in our moral being, and it cannot be lost even partially, without that moral being losing its reason for existence. There is no need to demonstrate that in such a state of collapse, the slightest cause for depression can easily give rise to desperate acts. When life is not worth living, everything becomes a pretext for ridding ourselves of it. For individuals are too closely involved in the life of society for it to be sick without their being affected, Durkheim added. Its suffering inevitably becomes theirs. Donald Trump is not a product of the leaked Podesta emails or James Comey or racism, although he and many who support him are racists, or Russian bots. He and his campaign, as the Mueller report has now made clear, did not conspire with Russia to steal the election. Demagogues arise from failed democracies plagued by rulelessness and anomie. They tell an enraged population what it wants to hear, and crudely, to the delight of the betrayed, ridicule the elites who sold them out. Removing Trump from office without confronting the rulelessness and anomie that define the lives of tens of millions of Americans would do nothing to restore democracy. In fact, it would probably consolidate the power of a Christianized fascism that cloaks itself in a cloying piety and false morality. Vice President Mike Pence, because he is a creature of the Christian right and has ingested its proto-fascist ideology, would probably be worse than Trump if he gained the presidency. The left, like most critics of Trump, personalizes our decay. It focuses myopically on Trump. It spits back the thought-terminating cliches about the Russians stealing our elections, while it refuses to examine the deep wounds within society, wounds exacerbated when the Democratic Party under Bill Clinton sold out working men and women. If we do not heal these wounds, which are certainly present in Canada, if we do not restore the social bonds shattered by predatory corporate capitalism, when the next financial crisis arrives, and it will arrive, this collective anomie will explode. Frightening demons, harnessing these dark, self-destructive pathologies, will rise from the depths of the ruleless morass. Climate science, like all science, will be dismissed for magical thinking. Corporate culture, like all cultures of death, makes war on love, truth, justice, and beauty, and numbs us to the questions about the search for meaning and the struggle to face our mortality. It spreads the dark viruses of hedonism, sexual sadism, greed, the cult of the self, the lust for power, and the glorification of violence. It seeks to crush the transcendent. It lacks the capacity for empathy. It is the enemy of the sacred. Nothing in life has an intrinsic value beyond a monetary value in the culture of death. All living entities are herded toward Moloch's altar. The only ethical and religious response is to smash the idols and drive the high priests from Moloch's temple. The nothingness into which the West is sliding is not the natural end, the dying, the sinking of a flourishing community of peoples, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in Ethics. Instead, it is again a specifically Western nothingness, a nothingness that is rebellious, violent, anti-God, and anti-human. Breaking away from all that is established, it is the utmost manifestation of all the forces opposed to God. It is nothingness as God. No one knows its goal or its measure. Its rule is absolute. It is a creative nothingness that blows its anti-God breath into all that exists, creates the illusion of waking it to new life, and at the same time sucks out its true essence until it too disintegrates into an empty husk and is discarded. Life, history, family, people, language, faith, the list could go on forever because nothingness spares nothing. All fall victim to nothingness. Religion, as H. Richard Niebuhr wrote, is a good thing for good people and a bad thing for bad people. And religion, as we see in the Christian right, which articulates and promotes white supremacy and Christian fascism, now rapidly filling Trump's ideological void, is anti-religious. The idol of a personal God, one that caters to and promotes the interests of those who profess homage to it, is the idolatry of Moloch. It is self-worship. It is heretical. And one of the most egregious failures of the liberal church has been its refusal to denounce these Christian heretics. The tacit tolerance of these heretics has given them religious legitimacy. You do not need to, as I did, spend 3 years at Harvard Divinity School to understand that Jesus did not come to make us rich, did not bless the white race above other races. Jesus, after all, was a person of color. It was the Romans who were white. Or sanctify the American empire's dropping of iron fragmentation bombs for 18 years up and down the Middle East. This is the theology of the Antichrist. It speaks only to itself. Those we battle as the society and the ecosystem disintegrate will increasingly appropriate the language of religion. They will seek to sanctify evil. These Christian fascists, like all idol worshipers, endow themselves with absolute power and authority. They claim to speak and act for God. They externalize evil. Evil for them is not the constant struggle to combat the dark forces within our own hearts, but is embodied in the demonized other: Muslims, immigrants, blacks, feminists, artists, intellectuals, or homosexuals. And once the other is eradicated, evil itself will somehow miraculously be eradicated. Except, of course, it won't. And these Manichaeans will, in frustration, oppress and kill new groups of demonized human beings with an even greater fury. These beliefs, common to all fundamentalists who can come in secular form, as we see with the new atheists, are the ideological cover for an emerging dystopia. We will only endure by inverting the world's values. To resist radical evil saves us, as Soren Kierkegaard wrote, from slipping into that loathsome void, that torment of despair. Hope comes by way of defeat. When we pit ourselves against the culture of death, and this means conducting acts of civil disobedience and noncompliance, it means becoming an outlaw in the eyes of the corporate state, then suffering and even death will not have the last word. We must find the moral and intellectual courage, as Albert Camus wrote, to être à la hauteur de son désespoir. Rise up to the level of our despair. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago describes prisoners in his camp organizing a work stoppage and hunger strike. He writes, "What the bosses would do, no one could predict. We thought that perhaps they would start firing on the huts again from the towers. The last thing we expected was any concession. We had never in our lives wrested anything from them, and our strike had the bitter tang of hopelessness. But there was a sort of satisfaction in this feeling of hopelessness. We had taken a futile, a desperate step. It could only end badly, and that was good. Our bellies were empty. Our hearts were in our boots. But some higher need was being satisfied. During those long, hungry days, evenings, nights, 3,000 men brooded over their 3,000 sentences, their families, their lack of families, all that had befallen and would yet befall them. And although the hearts in thousands of breasts could not beat together, and there were those who felt only regret, only despair, yet most of them kept time. Things are as they should be. We'll keep it up to spite you. Things are bad. So much the better. If there is any hope left to thwart the impending ecocide and extinction of the human species, we must build alternative communities and organizations dedicated to resistance, to pit power against power. We must, in wave after wave, carry out nonviolent acts of civil disobedience to shut down the capital cities of the major industrial countries, crippling commerce and transportation, until the ruling elites are forced to publicly state the truth about climate catastrophe, implement radical measures to halt carbon emissions by 2025, and empower national city and citizens committees free of corporate money and control to oversee the termination of our 150-year binge on fossil fuel. If we do not, we will face mass death. We can no longer remain silent. We can no longer permit obedience to segregate us from personal risk. The British-based group Extinction Rebellion has called for nonviolent acts of civil disobedience on April 15th in capitals around the world to reverse what they say is our one-way track to extinction. I do not know if this effort will succeed, but I do know it is the only mechanism left to force the ruling elites, who, although global warming has been documented for decades, have refused to carry out the measures needed to protect the planet and the human species. These elites, for this reason alone, are illegitimate, and they must be replaced. If we do not shake off our lethargy, our anomie, and resist, our misery, despondency, and feelings of helplessness will mount. We will become paralyzed. Resistance, especially given the bleakness before us, is about more than winning. It is about a life of meaning. It is about empowerment. It is a public declaration that we will no longer live according to the dominant lie. It is a message to the elites. You do not own us. It is about defending our dignity, agency, and self-respect. The more we free ourselves from the bondage of fear, to throw up barriers along the forced march towards ecocide, the more we will be enveloped by a strange kind of euphoria, one I often felt as a war correspondent documenting horrific atrocities and suffering to shame the killers. We obliterate in our acts of defiance, despair, even if our victories are Pyrrhic. We reach out to those around us. Courage is contagious. It is the spark that ignites mass revolt, and we should, even if we fail, at least choose how we will die. Resistance is the only action left that will allow us to remain psychologically whole, and it is the only action left that has any hope of halting the wholesale extinction of the human race, not to mention most other species. The times are inexpressibly evil, Daniel Berrigan wrote, and yet, the times are inexhaustibly good. In this time of death, some men and women, the resistors, work heartily for social change. We think of such people in the world, and the stone in our breast is dissolved. This means breaking the law. It means shutting cities down, streets, bridges, tunnels blocked. And this must be done with disciplined nonviolence. The state will seek, as it did with the Occupy movement, to demonize any massed movement and make people frightened of it. This is classic counterinsurgency doctrine. The resistance movements in the global South have figured this out. They are far better organized and disciplined than many of those in the industrialized West. We don't need that many people in the streets. 10, 20, 30,000 is enough to clog up the machine. These kinds of numbers cripple policing. The security forces lack the ability to carry out these numbers of arrests, especially if, as Extinction Rebellion has done in London, as soon as the riot police or the police show up, the crowd moves somewhere else in swarms. The goal is to hold the economies of these capital cities ransom until the elites tell the truth about the climate crisis, put in place programs to get carbon emissions to zero by 2025, and create these national assemblies based on sortition to oversee societal and economic transformation. This is an existential emergency. We have less than a decade to prevent the total eradication of human society. The mass actions this April may fizzle out, the crowds may not gather, the public may be apathetic. But if only a handful of us attempt to block a bridge or a road, even if we are swiftly swept away by the police, so swiftly there is not enough disruption to notice it is worth it. I am a father. I love my children. It is not about me. It is about them. This is what parents do. It is our call, the cross we are commanded to carry. It is what makes us human. It is what sustains the dim, absurd compassion and human kindness, love itself, which evil, with all its machines and bureaucratic power, its armies, its lies, its industrial violence, its wealth, its vast megaphones, has never been able to crush and never will. It may not ultimately be a battle we can win, but by fighting it, we sustain ourselves, we are enveloped and absolved by the sacred, we make faith possible. The poet Linda Gregg writes, "In the museum print room today, we looked at their Blake engravings. All were about a place that was not paradise. Everybody suffering, men on their backs, their faces upside down and exposed, legs raised and merging with the lines that meant a mountain. Women, unusually large, stood composed, discerning, concerned over the general condition of life. The curator said he cut directly into the metal, then inked it," I said. "Yes," she said. There was a spiral of mist filled with the shapes of lovers. I looked close to see if any were happy. At least two were. And in the sky, a couple sitting, embracing. Something weeps in me all the time, all the time. I said at random, wouldn't it be nice if one of these prints showed an angel crossing the border between heaven and this other realm, just the border? Jesus, you who are above all others, I hurt constantly inside, bleared with loneliness, exhausted by keeping what I love safe." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're going to open up the floor now for questions. We have two microphones here at the front, one at each aisle. I invite you all to come to the microphones to ask questions. I would also like to let the folks in the balcony know that you are welcome, of course. to ask questions, although we don't have a mic set up there, so you'll have to come down here. I see there are already people lined up, which is great. Pause for some waters here. But to give you a moment to think, and also for others to come line up, I thought I'd get the ball rolling. We've talked a lot today about journalism and the role of journalists. And you've said that you see your job as a journalist to be a truth teller, to tell the truth. And that's what good journalism is. Today you've shared a hard truth about the death of society, the self-inflicted death of society that we're facing. How do we, as consumers of the media and as searchers for good journalism and searchers for truth, how do we discern what's good and what's true, given the current landscape of journalism and media today? I know that's a huge question, but I'm really keen to hear what your thoughts are on it as a seasoned journalist.
Well, it's important to remember that real journalism has always existed on the margins. And it's been the alternative media, the non-commercial media, that has traditionally shamed the for-profit media into doing their job. So, as an example, I write for Truthdig. The editor is Robert Scheer, one of the great journalists in the United States, the former editor of Ramparts magazine, which, like Truthdig, has never made a penny in profit. In fact, Bob, at one point, had the idea that he would entice advertisers to Ramparts by taking the Pan American ad that appeared on the back of Time magazine and putting it on the back of Ramparts to show that big corporations supported the magazine, with the result that Pan Am sued him. But if you look at Ramparts in the 60s, they were the ones who exposed the COINTEL program. They were the ones who first wrote about the atrocities in Vietnam, including that iconic photograph of the small girl running down the road naked, being burned by napalm. That all came out. And that's always been the role. So I worked for the New York Times. I understand how the big media houses operate. And their unofficial motto is, do not alienate those on whom we depend for access and money. You can alienate them sometimes, but if you, as a reporter, keep alienating them, you become a management problem. So the importance of that alternative media universe is key. And there are some great reporters out there. I wrote a column on the plane over here about the Mueller report, and I named some of them: Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, and others. They're there, but they certainly exist on the margins, which I think has always been the case. I would say that at this point, broadcast media has largely abandoned journalism, including CNN, for entertainment. I mean, they function as kind of courtiers at Versailles. It's all about gossip, porn stars, and this ridiculous 3-year tarring of Trump as an agent of Putin, and P-tapes, and God knows what else, none of which was substantiated. So I think it's harder given the nature of the electronic media. I think CBC is a little better, although I know CBC has had its issues. I once got tangled with Kevin O'Leary, was his name. It's certainly more difficult for journalism, and because the ruling ideology of neoliberalism has lost credibility, those who are critics, and because the ruling elites no longer really have a counter-argument, the critics have come under assault. So in the name of, it's called Proper Not, it's this shadowy anonymous group named most left-wing websites, including the ones I write for and the ones that run my copy, as agents of a foreign power, i.e. Russia. And so Google, Facebook have imposed algorithms
that what it's called impressions, where you type in, let's say you write in the word imperialism, and I had written a column about imperialism that week, it would come up with other stories that dealt with imperialism. Now they've created filters so that doesn't happen. So just with Truthdig in the last 12 months, we've seen referrals by impressions decline from over 700,000 to below 200,000. And then you have the issue of net neutrality. So the ruling elites through Silicon Valley, which is an appendage of the security and surveillance apparatus, is clearly attempting to marginalize the critics who have already been pushed to the outer reaches of the media landscape. So you have to look, but they're there. I tend, like most journalists, I tend to read bylines rather than publications. Aretz, Gideon Levy, Amira Haas, Danny Rubenstein, all of whom write on the Palestinian issue. I think Aretz, the Israeli newspaper, probably does the best coverage of the Palestinians. So you can find them, but you have to be proactive. If you are passive consumers sitting in front of a screen, then you're just going to be titillated with the salacious and the tawdry and the ridiculous. So I don't own a television. It's probably a good place to start.
I'm caught in the dilemma of how to start with the right or the left, and whether it's our right or left or your right or left. But I will start over here on the right-hand side. We will just go back and forth as long as we have time. I will remind you, though, because there are people waiting behind you, please keep your questions as brief as possible and make sure there's a question in there so that Chris has something to interact with. Just a friendly reminder. So let's start over here.
I'd like to thank you very much for your talk this evening. You were part of Occupy, and another gentleman that you were with, Mark Bray, who wrote the Antifa book, the handbook. I'm not sure exactly how he would agree or disagree with your nonviolent civil disobedience stance.
He would disagree. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't want to speak on his behalf,
No,
but I'm sure you know him.
I know him and I read the book.
Right. So like in such a existential emergency, isn't it incumbent upon us to kind of do whatever we can to save things? I get it, what you're saying about nonviolent civil disobedience, but isn't that kind of the route that Chamberlain might have taken and other people in the past where they were just crushed? Occupy didn't make the results that many had hoped. And so my question is, I'm not sure what's going to happen with the Extinction Rebellion in April, but I'm just wondering if we might have to just step it up a bit. I don't know.
Well, first of all, I covered war. So you can't equate Chamberlain with nonviolent resistance. Chamberlain was the prime minister of a state, and as Max Weber has pointed out, essentially the definition of a state is that institution or entity that monopolizes what they consider to be legitimate use of violence. So that's just an analogy that doesn't work. When you talk about internal resistance, just on a very practical level, having covered conflicts, such as I spent 5 years covering the war in El Salvador, you needed arms shipments from Nicaragua. The Algerian Civil War would have never succeeded if they couldn't get arms shipments of Tunisia. So the idea that we can match firepower, unless Canada wants to start shipping large numbers of weapons to the United States, it just isn't going to work. It's not even remotely feasible. That's number one. Number two, revolutions, if you read the theory, great theorists of revolution, Crane Britton, Jeffrey Davies, and others, point out that no revolution succeeds unless a significant part of the ruling apparatus defects. And this is, the person who understood this very well, of all, however amoral he was Lenin. And Lenin's brother had been executed hung for attempting to kill the Tsar. But Lenin was fiercely opposed to the anarchist violence as something that was detrimental to the Bolshevik Revolution. I just left Paris on Sunday. So I was there with the Yellow Vests and the Black Bloc on the Champs-Élysées. And you had 20,000, roughly, Yellow Vest protesters and about 150 Black Bloc. Hyper-masculine, white men, largely. And the state loved it. And Macron used it to ban protests on the Champs-Élysées and to deploy 6,000 anti-terrorism soldiers throughout the city. So it's a matter of what will succeed. Revolution is not about catharsis. Revolution is about tactics. And having covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, and I covered the fall of the Stasi state in East Germany, I saw how that worked. So in September, Erich Honecker sent down an elite paratroop division to Leipzig to fire on the demonstrators, largely led by Lutheran clergy. And when they got there, the local city authorities refused to deploy them, and Honecker was out of power within a week. When the Cossacks were sent in to crush the bread riots in Petrograd and refused and joined the rioters, the Tsar, who was up on the front, was rushed back and had to abdicate in a railway carriage. When the Shah fled Iran, and the next day the head of the armed forces said that the army would no longer defend the regime collapsed. So that's how revolutions work. And essentially, that's the only weapon we have. It doesn't always work. It often doesn't work. But in the United States, I was in the Middle East and saw it. We have 60,000 members of the special forces alone. And really, special forces are just death squads. The idea that somehow we can match this is the language the state speaks really well. So nonviolence is the only effective tool that we have. And that's why the state seeks to demonize the movement, loves the Black Bloc. I think half of the Black Bloc are probably police. Because and just read any counterinsurgency manual, the object is to demonize the protest movement, make people afraid of it, and reduce its numbers so it can be crushed. Because once you have, I was at the climate march in New York, which was kind of the march to nowhere. Everybody went through police barricades to the West Side. But the next day, about 10 or 15,000 activists gathered down and occupied Wall Street, and we didn't know what was going to happen when we walked onto the street. But there were just too many of us. The police couldn't arrest that. They couldn't arrest 15,000 people. And that's what we have to do. That's the only, so it really requires discipline, and it requires understanding how power works, and it requires really making a moral appeal, because the foot soldiers, all the cops in New York City, for instance, to make extra money, they're off duty, they're rented by corporations like Goldman Sachs for $37 an hour. So they stand in the lobbies and watch these multimillionaire criminals get into their limit. They see it. When I did a protest, was in a protest against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan a few years ago in front of the White House with several hundred veterans, mostly from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. 133 of us were arrested. And what was fascinating and unexpected is that as we were being cuffed, it turns out the police in Washington, most of them are in the National Guard, and had been in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they were cuffing us saying, keep protesting. This is what terrifies the ruling elites, not some 19-year-old kid with $600 worth of knee pads and elbow pads throwing rocks through Starbucks windows. They love that. And Bray's book, by the way, he draws on, his thesis is that there wasn't enough violence in Nazi Germany against the fascists. And this is just so historically inaccurate. In fact, there were constant street clashes between the communists and the fascists, I admit, largely provoked by the fascists. And it empowered the fascists who promised law and order, a society that just got sick of these violent clashes taking place in their streets. So not only is Bray wrong, but the book is just historically incredibly inaccurate, and the whole the kind of historical thesis that he uses to make this argument is false.
Thank you, Chris, and everyone for being here tonight. I was wondering if I could ask about your opinion on Venezuela, specifically U.S. and I guess to a lesser extent Canadian involvement in Venezuela, and also the media's coverage of Venezuela.
Well, the coverage has been awful. I mean, talk about interference in elections. I'm no friend of Maduro, but I mean, who the hell is Guaido? I mean, where did he come from? Nobody ever heard of him. He's a classic kind of CIA puppet. It's appalling. I mean, I think what's so appalling about it is that, yes, the United States has long engaged in this kind of activity with the same kind of tactics. If you look at 1973 with the overthrow of Allende in Chile, there were power outages and gas shortages and food, all orchestrated by America's greatest war criminal, Henry Kissinger. So the tactics were the same, but in 73 it was clandestine. Here it's just completely naked and in the open. But I'm not sure they're going to succeed. If they haven't succeeded by now, it's going to be tough. Yeah, but it's appalling. I mean, the United States, let's say, for the last 18 years, has engaged in what historians of empire called micro-militarism. It's that final stage of empire when empires disintegrate and they just blindly stumble into military fiascos, which is, of course, what's happened. I mean, we have just created one failed state after another, huge refugee crisis, which has tilted the political climate in Europe towards these neo-fascist movements, although countries like Hungary and Poland don't actually have any refugees. But, and that's fatal. So what you're seeing is that with the death of the American empire, a kind of an irresponsible and thoughtless use of force everywhere, which is ultimately fatal to empire. I mean, if you look, for instance, and that's what I mean. The invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was the signals the end. It's $7 trillion, and the United States is literally, if you've been there, the infrastructure is collapsing. Half the country lives in poverty. I mean, pretty bad poverty, and it's just they're unwinnable, intractable. So, for instance, when at the end of the the Athenian Empire, they attacked Sicily, and their entire fleet was sunk, and most of their soldiers were killed. Or you look in '56 when the British tried to retake Suez and had to retreat in humiliation. This is the stage that we're in, and so this kind of ham-fisted, naked attempt to use force, coupled with the destruction of the State Department, of any kind of form of diplomacy, is characteristic of the dying stages of all empires.
My question relates to your last page of your book, where you say resistance is not only about battling forces of darkness, it is about becoming a complete human being. And I would argue that you need to write the second book about what I'd call altruistic activism or spiritual activism, that's what empowers us to act in the face of evil. And there are many examples of that happening. We just had an fostering ally symposium here on the weekend, showing that when you face up to homophobia, it declines. Anti-racism, dealing with violence against women, all of these are small community activist movements. And we need to hear more of those stories, especially from the United States. We have incredible movements in Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation is showing that. And instead of some of us who were in the book club, reading your book, we're afraid of reading the middle chapters. And that's because they're hard witnesses to bear, but we have to toughen up our love to be able to hear those hard stories. But once you open that trauma, we need to also be tough to stand up for it. So could you please talk about that a bit?
When I wrote my book on the Christian right, which was over 10 years ago now, so I come out of a religious tradition, but I really didn't know anything about the Christian right. I come out of the left wing of the church. The Barragans were heroes in my house, King. And I went in there with the kind of liberal prejudice. But as I started doing interviews with followers in the Christian right, you'd have to be heartless not to be moved. Their lives had really disintegrated. Opioid addictions, alcoholism, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, rampant, gambling, porn addictions. I mean, their world disintegrated, bankruptcies, evictions. So they retreated into the last redoubt where they could survive, which was magical thinking. And what's fascinating about the megachurches is that they function, I really found, having spent a lot of time in them, as cults. So you come into, these megachurches, unlike Presbyterian churches, have like comfortable seats like this and nice music, and it's kind of warm, and that's the difference when Hannah Arendt writes about totalitarian movements between propaganda and indoctrination. But then they suck you into their forms of indoctrination. They break you down, they assign you disciplers, they sever you from your family, you're there every night. And what I found is that they really couldn't cope with the real world. Without magic Jesus, and part of their anger when you couldn't talk rationally with them about creationism or any of this kind of stuff, because this magical belief system was all they had left. So with this segment of the population, there is no rational discussion. I mean, I was in the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky, and they had a recreation of the Garden of Eden with a waterfall, and Eve and Adam were naked in the pool, but you couldn't see Eve's plastic breasts. I mean, and they had a T-Rex there with a saddle. And the guide was taking people through and said, well, I'm sure you all wonder why T-Rex has such big teeth. It's because Adam and Eve used T-Rex to open the coconuts. Well, it's funny here, but when you're in a group of 40 people who believe it, it's really terrifying. So I came to the conclusion at the end of that book that while I think every point you make about rising up and being vocal, which I am, against homophobia or the various forms of bigotry and racism, the only hope was reintegrating these people into the society where they could find a place. And that short of that, this kind of magical thinking and bigotry and externalization of evil and demonization of others would only grow. So the rise of Trump, the ground was seeded by the Christian right. Trump is a mega pastor. I mean, I was around these guys. You can't get much sleazier than this. They prey off of the despair of the people in these mega churches. They're often millionaires. I would say anecdotally, at least from my work or observations, the primary difference between the mega pastors and Trump is that their sexual proclivities were probably kinkier than Trump's. But people ask, how can the Christian right ally with Trump? I said, they are the same. There's no difference. The whole form of denying science. And so, without that economic component, these kinds of hatreds, bigotries will only grow. And of course, in the last 10 years, it's only gotten worse. So while yes, we have to speak out against these activities, what we really have to address, and you've read the book, the core message of that book is that until we rebuild those social bonds, until we address this enemy, things will only get worse. And, you know, you have one of the great political figures who understood this, Tommy Douglas. I mean, he got it. And that's kind of, I gave a talk, I think it was the University of Winnipeg, which makes me love Canada. So I gave my blistering revolutionary radical talk, and then I saw these professors sit in the back row. One of them stands up and goes, okay, before he begins, I want the students to know that he's nothing more than a radical Keynesian. But it turns out they were all Marxists. I thought, man, that would never happen at Princeton. That's like, and it's actually true. I am kind of a radical Keynesian. So I'm kind of just a 1970s Swedish socialist. I mean, you saw in the Scandinavian countries, heavily regulated capitalism. Everybody had health care. There weren't homeless people in the streets. Mentally ill people were taken care of. A senior high school teacher earned as much as a doctor. You know, we have the wealth, certainly, to create a society like that. And we must really rebuild a socialist system quickly, especially as we are watching the world's financial elites engage in the same kind of speculative games that they engaged in before the 2007 crash, or we're in big trouble. So yes, I think we should stand up, I think we should be outspoken, but we can't divorce it from the vast social inequality, now the worst in the United States in American history, and the creation of an oligarchy. This goes back to Aristotle. 3,000 years ago, Aristotle said that in an oligarchic or an aristocratic society where you had a concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a tiny elite, the only two options were tyranny or revolution. It's not a particularly new political understanding, but it's one we seem to have forgotten.
Hi. Early on in your presentation, you said that peace costs about as much as war.
That was Berrigan. But yeah.
Pardon me?
I was quoting Daniel Berrigan.
Okay, well, even still, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because the way that I see it is that war disproportionately affects people of color, and that oftentimes the citizens of those countries that are occupied by the United States or Canada, for example, the citizens there are often dehumanized, and that also comes into our nation here, where the dehumanization continues. So I'm wondering how peace and war could cost us similar.
He's saying that we have to be willing to make personal sacrifices as great as those who perpetuate war. I mean, Berrigan was militantly nonviolent, and but at the same time, he and his brother, Phil Berrigan, by the time he died, had spent 11 years in prison, were constantly going to prison. They went in, for instance, in Catonsville, Maryland, and burned they took the draft records out and burned them, and then stood there and prayed until they were arrested. Berrigan spent 23 months in a federal prison for that. So what he's saying is that we have to be willing to carry out acts of self-sacrifice, which are demanded by those who perpetuate war, if we are going to challenge the war industry and the purveyors of violence and injustice. But always through nonviolence, always. That's the point.
Hi, thanks. You'll forgive me, I've actually written it into my phone, so I'm just going to read it. In the final chapter of America, the Farewell Tour, you write, quote, "The seductive inducements to conformity, money, celebrity, prizes, grants, book contracts, hefty lecture fees, important academic and political positions, and a public platform are scorned by those who resist." How do you reconcile that statement with your own position as a prize-winning author of 14 traditionally published books, lecturer at an elitist institution, minister of a mainstream church, husband of an actor, resident of a city with an average income of $118,000, and here now on a public stage at another elitist institution? I don't ask this to be glib. I ask this because most revolutions actually start with educated elites, and that always presents a personal and social paradox. For example, in Farewell, you often reference Karl Marx. Marx was a well-educated man from an affluent family, and he later accepted financial support from Frederick Engels, who had become considerably wealthy through ownership of the very same exploitative capitalist factories the two men decried. So where is the line between pragmatic self-preservation and outright hypocrisy? Or to put it another way, can the personal not be political?
It depends, where your loyalty or your fealty lies. So, in my own case, I lost my job at the New York Times, which meant losing my pension, my medical benefits. It was, I'd been in Gaza, so I don't pretend that it was close to the kind of sacrifices that oppressed people like the Palestinians endure, but it was a difficult, certainly at the moment, and a hard choice. I was finished in American journalism. No newspaper was ever going to hire me because I had crossed the line and begun to denounce the war. And I began looking for a job. I don't have a doctorate, so I began looking for a job to teach English in a high school. And my first book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and with a title like that, nobody thought it would sell, happened to explode by word of mouth and sold 400,000 copies. But it wasn't my intent. I didn't write the book to make money. In fact, I was pretty certain no one would buy it, as was the publisher, which is why the advance was minuscule. And I just got lucky. So I think it's a matter of, I've never sat down and written a book and thought about the audience. I will sell the book. I'll go out after it's written and I was on book tour from the end of August until October. But I won't write it. I don't write it with that intent. And, you ask about my own situation. What happened, I was talking to, I don't know if anyone's read David Harvey's work. He's really good. His book on a brief history of neoliberalism is brilliant. He's a Marxist economist. And I was talking to David not long ago, and what happens often with a writer, it's very similar to a musician, is that you build your own audience. So, and they know that, they track it. So if I write a book, I almost always can sell about 40 or 50,000 hardback and another 60,000. It's that same audience. Now, the United States has over 300 million people, so we're not even talking about 1%. But it is the loyalty of that audience that makes me able to make a living, and I'm fortunate. But it wasn't by design. And in fact, when I don't pretend that, I'm suffering in any way, but when you are a writer, you live like an artist. So, I had my second year of writing that book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, with Joe Sacco. We ran out of money, and literally when I did my taxes, I had negative income, and have spent several of the last few years trying to pay it off. So that's like all artists. And my loyalty is, I'm not an artist, I'm a writer, but my loyalty is to what I write, first and foremost, and then I will take whatever comes. And I have been, as you point out, successful in that sense. But number one, that's not how I define success, and that was not my intent. And I'm constantly clashing with the Israel lobby in the United States because of my very public support for the BDS movement. And that sees me constantly not only blocked from lecturing, but even to the point of being disinvited. I was invited to speak at the University of Pennsylvania. They mounted a huge campaign against me. I was disinvited. And so I don't pretend that I pay a particularly harsh price for where I stand, but I do pay a price. I'm not on MSNBC. I am locked out of the mainstream media, and I used to be at the epicenter of the mainstream media because the positions I take are not palatable. So, I try to live with as much integrity as I can and do the best I can. And you can Google my house in Princeton. It's not very impressive.
Thank you.
Let's take our last question from the floor.
So you've talked about acts of civil disobedience as being sort of the only way forward. I guess I have a two-part question. Do you still vote? And we've here in Alberta have an election coming up. I'm engaged to some degree and trying to do what I can to promote who I think is the best candidate and the best party. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to whether you think there's any merit in participating in the democratic institutions that we still have, especially maybe here in Canada, where on a provincial level, for instance.
Right, well, Canada's a little healthier than the United States in that corporate money doesn't dominate your political process. Hillary Clinton had to raise $1 billion, or she raised $1 billion to run for, this is insane amounts of money. So I vote, but I don't take it that seriously. And I don't vote for Democrats. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter. I, since 2000, have voted, part of it's personal. I just couldn't watch Barack Obama go to AIPAC and fawn over the Israel lobby. I've been in El Shifa Hospital in Gaza. I've seen the bodies of those children. And I thought, you know what, I don't care. Everyone else can sell out the Palestinians. I'm just not going to. It's personal. I am well aware that half of my students would not be in prison but for Bill Clinton and Joe Biden. And I'm just not going to sell them out. I don't care if it's, because ultimately it's movements. If, you have to pit power against power. And there's a story I've told before about Kissinger's memoirs, and please don't buy his book. But he's writing about one of the last huge anti-war demonstrations in Washington. Tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators, I think it's 1971, are surrounding the White House, and Nixon has put empty city buses around the White House to protect it. And he's looking through the window with Kissinger, and he says, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And it is our job to make sure that's where people in power are. But that doesn't come unless we have movements. And this hyper-individualism of the consumer society is a very, as Gramsci understood, a very effective way of disempowerment. So, as Emma Goldman said, if voting was that effective, it would be illegal. I vote, but I don't waste a lot of time on it. And I at least vote with my conscience. Even, if nobody else votes for Ralph Nader, at least I will. I think Ralph Nader, by the way, is one of the great unsung American heroes who has been fighting against corporate crime and capitalism longer, more effectively, and with more integrity than any other American. Yeah.
We'll take one more. This will have to be the last one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, quick question.
Well, thank you for coming out, Chris. My question pertains more for us students who are faced with the immense challenges that you bring up. And hearing these kind of brings up a feeling of helplessness. So I'm always focused on the hope and what we can do. So my question is, how can we build these alternative communities you speak of within the dominant capitalist system?
Well, the more that you can sever yourself from the tentacles of corporate power, the freer you are. So that becomes, local agriculture, public banks. The more mechanisms you can build to, cooperatives. There's injustice everywhere if you look. One of the stories even to this day, with the hundreds of stories I wrote as a newspaper reporter, that I still look back and find a great deal of satisfaction for having done, took place when I was in high school. And I was a scholarship student at a very elite boarding school in New England, where the Rockefellers went. And the men who worked in the kitchen lived up over the kitchen, and no student was allowed to go there. It's one of the richest prep schools in the country. And so, of course, I went up there with a camera. and they were living in squalor. And so I thought perhaps the best time to publicize this would be in the commencement issue of the newspaper, when all the parents and the trustees would be there, which I did. And when of course, they were shamed into doing something, and they renovated the living spaces over the summer. And when I came back, the pot washers and kitchen staff had put a plaque on the wall in my memory. And I thought I was 17 years old. And I thought, wow, that's what it means to be a journalist. So if you look for it, the problem is, at so many schools like Princeton, they walk past the grounds crew and they're invisible. And when you live in privilege, you have that luxury of making the oppressed invisible. And it's our role to make them visible, to lift up their voices and their experiences and their suffering, and shame a society into carrying out justice. So it's here on this campus, without question. I don't know what your debt burdens are like. In American colleges, they're obscene. I mean, you will find seniors in college with $100,000 of debt. And I said, you just need to get 10 of those people. That's $1 million. And you need to go chain yourself to the president's door. This is insane. What we're doing, throwing our young people into debt peonage, and then they can't get jobs. And they're paying $700 a month. I mean, debt peonage, as any African American knows, is a form of social control. And of course, every time I come to Canada, I see this creeping process. I mean, we do everything wrong, and then 10 years later, Canada does it. I can't figure it out. So it's here. And I think once you engage in those struggles, as I tried to say in my talk, this is the best antidote to despair and hopelessness. And often it's Pyrrhic. I mean, you may know Barack Obama at midnight on the last day of December in 2011, when he thought no one was looking, signed into law Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. And what it did was overturn the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which had prohibited the U.S. military from being used as a domestic police force. And so I sued him in federal court. And no one thought we would win, including my own lawyers. And I did win. And my feeling in suing him was, I'm just not going to roll over and take it. And the administration utterly freaked out. I mean, the lawyers from the NSA were like in the judge's chambers the day of the ruling, trying to get the temporary indictment lifted. It was overturned on appeal, so it is law. But it is, taking on and challenging a monolithic power like that when it carries out an egregious form of injustice. Just taking it on is empowering. And I mean, every once in a while, you actually succeed. But what it did, of course, was gave widespread publicity to a very important ruling that now Donald Trump has the power to use, which would have gone unnoticed. And so it is that engagement with the struggle. What Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian, calls sublime madness. As things get worse and worse, it is the struggle itself that will keep us psychologically whole. But if we grasp reality and remain passive, then that despair and lethargy and despondency, anomie will only eat away at us. It's kind of counterintuitive. You can watch it on YouTube, when we did that march in Washington, it was snowing, and most all of us had been in pretty serious combat. And it suddenly, when we went to the White House, it was silent. And there was one Vietnam veteran who was just beating a drum. And I would say, of that 133 of us, almost everyone was crying. I mean, I say that's my church right there. And you walk away from that so empowered. It doesn't make sense, really, but I mean, in a rational sense, but it is that act of defiance that sustains us. And the worse it's going to get, and it is going to get worse, the more we don't resist, the more it will eat away at us. And that's just a fact. I mean, I go into that prison twice a week. And, people say, well, what keeps you going? And I said, anger. I mean, if you walk out of that prison, you're not angry, something's wrong. You don't have a heart. And that's what Augustine said, Isn't this college called Augustine? Hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and the courage to say that they don't remain the way they are. And that's why, especially at this moment in human history, resistance is absolutely vital, not only from a moral sense, not only do we have a moral responsibility, Camus writes about this, I think, quite well, but it is going to be our greatest psychological protection.
Let's give another round of applause for Mr. Hedges.